Greetings, young scientists. We're here today to finish up our evidence for evolution. So for those of you who don't like sitting and listening to these videos, I do not think that this is going to take us very long to finish this on up. That being said, the final two pieces for evolutionary evidence are really strong pieces of evidence that I think are really fascinating if you sit down and think about it. One are the biochemical similarities that we see among all species that are living on Earth. What I mean by that is this: every species on Earth has the same 4 bases of DNA, again suggesting a common ancestor. Also, too, if you look at organisms on Earth, there are lots of DNA sequences that are actually exactly the same. If you're fascinated by this, you can see some proteins that are common across all species here on Earth. One of them is a cytochrome protein, where the genetic code, the DNA sequence, is exactly the same for every single species on Earth. We mentioned this before in our DNA unit, but the process of transcription and translation, that happens on every single species on Earth. Where the process goes from transcription, taking DNA, converting it to RNA. That RNA then gets converted to a protein at the ribosome. Speaking of ribosomes, if you look at the amino acids on Earth, there are only 20 of them. You might remember from our from our DNA unit, that we talked about DNA going into RNA and RNA being made into a protein. Proteins are made from amino acids. And you might remember in class when we talked about there only being 20 amino acids for humans. And I think I was a little too specific on that, because it turns out it's the same 20 amino acids that make up every single organism on Earth. So it doesn't matter if you're a slug, a butterfly, or Mr. Virtue. You still have the same 20 different amino acids that are arranged in different sequences to give you different proteins, and that's what makes us look different from one another, and what makes us look different from other animals as well. So, lastly, speaking of amino acids and proteins, if you remember, that's the stuff that makes up our body. You might remember us talking about collagen, keratin, or hemoglobin. Those are some classic proteins in living systems. Proteins are the building blocks, or the stuff, of every single organism on Earth, again suggesting a common ancestor, because we all have the same basic building blocks that make up all life here on Earth. Our last piece of evidence for evolution comes from biogeography. Biogeography is the study of species distribution on islands, and comparing the species distribution on islands to the mainland that it is closest to. One of the most fascinating things that you will find is that if you look at islands that are very, very far away from any continental landmass, islands, especially distant islands, tend to have their own unique species that are found on that island and found nowhere else. This is true because, if you remember from last year in environmental science, there was that great supercontinent, Pangaea, and as the supercontinent broke up, these small islands were far away from any mainland, and therefore their habitat, or their environment, was completely different than any other environment on Earth. So when we look at these islands all distributed around the world, we find lots of species that are said to be endemic. Endemic species are species that are only found on that island, which again suggests that these organisms became uniquely adapted to their environment as islands moved away from continental landmasses over time. The other thing that we find is that species on islands that are relatively close to continental landmasses, sometimes those islands will have their own species, but they will bear a striking resemblance to species that are found on the closest continental landmass, which again suggests that some organisms of a species migrated away from the continental landmass, landed on an island, and then became uniquely adapted to that island's habitat, but sometimes they still retain some of the structures from the continental species that they migrated away from. So, when we look at the evidence for evolution, again, we come up with a massive amount of evidence. Each one of these categories here, if you were to look at it, look it up on your own, you would find a massive amount of evidence. The fossil record, biochemistry. We talked about developmental biology or embryology, where organisms tend to look the same in development. Which again suggests a common ancestry. Comparative anatomy. We talked about homologous structures and analogous structures. And we also talked about biogeography as well. Okay, so that is essentially it for our evidence of evolution. We'll have one more slide that we're going to look at here. I put this on here for no other reason other than I don't want you to get confused with how we have these variations in a population. Remember, mutations and gene shuffling. Gene shuffling is that crossing over that happens in meiosis. You can see the picture of the chromosomes crossing over on your screen right now. That's how we get variation in a population. Most variations mean nothing. Some variations actually hurt an organism and they will be selected against. But we do have variations that sometimes allow organisms to better survive and reproduce. When those variations arise, then those variations get passed on from one generation to the next. The accumulation of those variations, we call them adaptations because they help you better survive and reproduce. And that's how we can see species or organisms, check that, species change over time. So I hope this helps you understand the massive amount of evidence that supports evolution. And until next time, we'll see you online. Thanks for listening.